Hello, and we're going to go over the Olivet Discourse. And the Olivet Discourse is when Jesus was on the earth, okay? And his disciples were admiring the temple. And they were looking at the temple, and he walked out of the temple and he prophesied the destruction of the temple, and then proceeded over onto the Mount of Olives, where he discussed with them the questions that they asked him. And then also after the questions that they asked him, there were three questions that they asked him. And then after that, he volunteered some information that he wanted them to know. So let's just go ahead and get started with the Olivet Discourse. And whenever you study the Olivet Discourse, you have to study the three chapters that are about the Olivet Discourse to get the entire information. Okay? And the three chapters are Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. So we're going to get through the first question today. Okay? But there are going to probably be three studies here. The first question, the second and third question together, and then that which Jesus told them afterwards. Okay? So let's just go ahead and get started. We're going to start with Luke 21. Okay? In Luke 21 verse 1, gives us a little bit of insight that the other two don't give us. Okay? And it says, Luke 21 verse 1, "And he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw also a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites." And keep in mind, a mite is like a penny. Okay? And this is Jesus that's seeing this. Okay? He looked and he saw both Jesus. So he, again, Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all. For all these out of their abundance have put in offerings for God, but she, out of her poverty, put in all the livelihood that she had." So Jesus and his disciples are in the temple, and he's talking to his disciples about people putting the money in the offering. And these 4 verses of the opening of the Olivet Discourse, I believe what they're telling us is to do what you can with what you have. Okay? Wherever you're at. Okay, so keep in mind that you don't, just because maybe you're not super rich and you can't give a lot, it's saying give what you can. Okay, and even though she only gave 2 mites or 2 pennies, Jesus saw that as giving more than all the rest. Okay, because it was all that she had. Okay, so now let's go ahead and jump into Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24 is going to be our primary chapter. Okay, because I think that Matthew 24 gives us the best understanding of the 3 questions. Okay, so let's just go ahead and get started with Matthew 24. Matthew 24 verse 1. "Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple." So you can imagine this, that Jesus comes walking out of the temple after he was in the temple, and they're already outside looking at the building. And this is the second temple. Okay, now remember that there was Solomon's temple that was destroyed by the Babylonians. This is not it. Then Zerubbabel, 70 years later in the Persian Empire, Zerubbabel built the second temple. Okay, and this is the temple we're talking about, the second temple, because King Herod had beautified this temple to gain favor with the Jewish people. And he made this temple beautiful. It didn't compare to Solomon's temple, but it was a beautiful temple as far as buildings go in Jerusalem. So when Jesus came out of the temple, he saw his disciples. His disciples came up and showed him the buildings of the temple. So they're saying how beautiful this temple is. And then Jesus, in verse 2, it says, "And Jesus said to them, 'Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down.'" So Jesus steps into the shoes of a prophet, and he prophesies the destruction of the temple. And then you can imagine, after he prophesies the destruction of the temple, he starts to walk over towards the Mount of Olives. Okay, and that's going to give us more information as we get into it. And then in verse 3 it says, "Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives," that's Jesus, "the disciples came up to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So you see clearly here three questions. When will these things be? Talking about the destruction of the temple. That happened in 70 AD. Okay? And what will be the sign of your coming? And the sign of your coming is a reference to the second coming of Jesus, the second coming of Christ. It has nothing to do with the rapture. It's to do with, and I'll tell you why we know that, because think about it this way. Jesus just prophesied the destruction of the temple. These disciples of his are familiar with the Word of God. Okay? They don't know all about the rapture yet. Okay? We don't get information on the rapture until the 14th chapter of John. And then also, Paul gives us a complete understanding of the rapture of the church and a complete understanding of the church. So, but at this point, they're speaking of the second coming of Christ, and they're thinking there must be a war. Okay, what's going to be the sign of your coming? When will these things be? In other words, when will the temple be destroyed? What will be the sign of your coming? You're coming back to the earth to rule and reign. Okay, and the end of the age. When will the end of the age be? Okay, these are the three questions that they ask. And you can also think of their thought process here as, if the temple is going to be destroyed, there must be war. Okay, and remember in Zechariah chapter 14, which they were familiar with, that has to do with the Battle of Armageddon. Okay, and it has to do with the war that's going to ensue. So this is their thought process. So we got the three questions very clearly. And then in verse 4 of Matthew 24, Jesus starts to answer their first question. Okay, and their first question is, when will these things be? The destruction of the temple. Okay, and Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. So you see, he's answering that first question, and he's saying you, speaking specifically to his disciples. Okay? And then he says, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilence, and earthquakes in various places. Now he's talking about at the time of the disciples. And then he gets into verse 8. It says, all these things are the beginnings of sorrows. So what is he telling them? He's saying that you're going to see all this stuff, but this is just the beginning. Okay? Remember that in John, I believe it's in John, he says, 15:18, he says that if the world hates you, remember they hated me first. Okay? So when Jesus came to the earth, he brought the kingdom of God with him. Okay? And people that would believe in him and be saved. Okay? And what Jesus is telling them here is these are the beginnings of sorrows, meaning that suffering of God's people are going to happen. Persecution is going to happen. But this is just the beginning. Okay? And we know from studying the book of Revelation that it's going to get worse and worse and worse. Okay? And again, if the world hates you, remember, it hated me first, he said. So let's just move on into verse 19 or verse 9. It says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. So again, he's as a reference directly to his disciples. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. And it says, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. So deliverance. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached to all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. So you can see he's talking directly to them about the temple and the destruction of the temple. And then he also brings it out to the point where he comes to the end. Okay? And Jesus has a tendency to do that when he's teaching. He goes and starts a little bit early and then gives you more information towards the future. Okay? And we're going to notice that as we go through this. And that is Matthew. So let's just go ahead and see what Mark has to say. Mark chapter 13 and verse 1, he says, "Then, as he," that would be Jesus, "went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, 'Teacher, see what manner of stone and what buildings are here.'" So remember, in Matthew, they were showing him the building. Now we know that one of his disciples specifically, and we don't know which one it was, said to him, "Teacher, see what manner of stone and what buildings are here." And Jesus answered and said to him, Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." Again, a match. And he's prophesying about the temple's destruction. And then in verse 3 it says, "Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately." So now we know that after he walked out of the temple and prophesied the temple's destruction, then walked over to the Mount of Olives, as they followed behind him and discussed his prophecy about the destruction of the temple, they formulated these three questions. And they also formulated who is it that's going to go up and talk to Jesus or ask these three questions. And we know who it is from this book of Mark. It's Peter, James, John, and Andrew. And then it says in verse 4, "Tell us, when will these things be?" The same question, the destruction of the temple. "And what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled?" So this is a reference to the first question. Okay? So in Mark, it doesn't give us all three of the questions. Matthew gives us all three questions that they had asked. All right? And then it says, "And Jesus answered them." Jesus answering them began to say, "Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and will deceive many. But when you see and when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be troubled. For such things must happen, but the end is not yet." So, again, he's talking to his disciples about the question that they ask him, the first question. When will these things be? The destruction of the temple. And then in verse 8 of Mark 13 says, "For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines and troubles. These are the beginnings of sorrows." Again, up to that point, he's talking specifically to his disciples, and he's saying these things are going to be the beginning of sorrows. "But watch out for yourselves, for they will deliver you to councils." Again, he's talking to the disciples, "and you will be beaten in the synagogues. You will be brought before rulers and kings for my name's sake, for a testimony to them. And the gospel must be preached to all the nations." So now he's telling them, and this is a reference to before the rapture is going to come. He's saying the gospel must be preached, but he's specifically talking to them. And it says, "But when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak. But whatever is given to you in that hour, speak that. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit." So he's telling them, don't worry about what you're going to say. The Holy Spirit will give you the wisdom and the words to prophesy and to help these people. Okay? And then it says in verse 12, "Now brother will betray brother to death, and father his children, or father his child, and children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end shall be saved." So that's the end of the first question in Mark. Let's go ahead and see what Luke has to say. Luke, he goes into this first question. He starts answering it. Let's just get started here in Luke 5. Luke 21:5 says, "Then, as some spoke of the temple, how it is adorned with beautiful stones and donations, he said, 'These things which you see, The days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. So again, Luke is getting in here on the prophesied destruction of the temple. And remember that this temple destruction was going to happen approximately 37 years later in 70 AD. Okay? And it says in verse 7, so they ask him, saying, Teacher, but when will these things be? Again, the destruction of the temple. And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place? So, again, a reference to that first question. So what will be the signs when these things are going to take place? All right. So both Mark and Luke are very focused on that first question. Matthew gives us all three questions. Okay. And then in verse 8, Jesus begins to answer again that first question. All right. And it says in verse 8 of Luke 21, and he said, take heed that you not be deceived. For many will come in my name, saying, I am he, which is the Messiah or the Anointed One. And the time has drawn near. Therefore, do not go after them. But when you hear of wars and commotions, do not be terrified. For these things must come to pass first, but the end will not come immediately. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be great earthquakes in various places, and famines and pestilence. And there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. So notice here in verse 11, he's starting to take it out, all the way out into the time of the Great Tribulation. Fearful signs and great signs in heaven. Okay? But he's still talking to the disciples. Notice verse 12 very clearly. It says, but before these things, so now he brings it back to the disciples. But before these things, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. But it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Therefore, settle it in your hearts, not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. You will be betrayed, even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends. And they will put some of you to death. And then verse 17 says, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. So again, he's still talking to his disciples. But not a hair of your head shall be lost. By your patience, possess your souls. So he's telling them that not even death is going to be able to separate them from God. Okay, remember Romans chapter 8? And again, we know that in John 15:18, if the world hates you, remember it hated him first. Okay, so there's persecution. And in that day, there was lots of persecution. And maybe people don't realize this, but whenever that happened, the destruction of the Second Temple, more than 1 million people were killed. Okay, that's a lot of people. That's a big war. All right, this rebellion started in approximately 68 AD. Okay, the Jewish people hadn't had their own government place for them all the way since the Babylonian Empire destroyed the first temple. And then remember, after the destruction of the first temple, Solomon's temple, then Zerubbabel built the second temple. Herod beautified it during the time of the Roman Empire, but all the way through there, they didn't have a place of their own. They were wanting a place of their own. Okay, even though they lived there, it was still under Roman rule. And 68 AD when they started to rebel, then by 70 AD, the Roman legions, led by General Titus, which was the emperor's son, actually came and destroyed, not only killing many Jewish people, but he also destroyed the second temple. Okay, and this is what we're talking about. So remember, everything that we've talked about up to this point is history. It's not stuff that we have to worry about. It's stuff that happened prior to the temple's destruction. Okay? And Luke here is going to give us information that's going to clarify that and make sure that we do understand that that is the case. Okay? And now Luke is going to give us information that the other two don't give us. Starting in verse 20, it says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies," and this is a reference to General Titus and the Roman legion, okay? "Then know that its desolation is near." So the desolation of Jerusalem is near when you see it surrounded by armies. "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let those who are in the country not enter her. Let not those who are in the country enter her." So Jesus is literally telling them, when they see General Titus and the Roman legion coming, flee. Okay? And this is another reason why when General Titus and the Roman legion came to put down this rebellion, so to speak, by the Jewish people, people fled. And they fled north mainly, okay, up into Damascus and into Asia Minor, which is present-day Turkey. And that's why 25 years later, if that was 70 AD, remember 95 AD is when John received the book of Revelation. And he received the book of Revelation on an island, Patmos, off the coast of Turkey. And there were 7 churches that were located in Asia Minor, which is present-day Turkey, at the time that John received the book of Revelation in 95 AD. So the reason that it was there, all those godly people were there, and the 7 churches were there in Asia Minor, is because in 70 AD they listened to Jesus and they fled. Okay? So it says, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people." It's talking about the Jewish people. "And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and be led away captives into all nations." Remembering that when the Babylonians destroyed the first temple, Solomon's temple, and people were taken captive, they were taken captive to Babylon, but they were taken captive all over the place. Remember, Babylon was an empire that had many nations. The same thing with Rome here. Rome was an empire, and Rome had many nations. So when it says, "And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations," it's talking about not just to Rome, okay, but to all nations that were in the Roman Empire, okay? And it says in the end of verse 24, it says, "And Jerusalem be trampled by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled." So this is a very amazing verse, because this second sentence in verse 24 of the book of Luke 21:24, "And Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles." So let's think about that a minute. Jerusalem was trampled by the Gentiles. It started when Babylon came in and destroyed the first temple. Okay? And then after that, Persia. Persia also owned the area of Jerusalem. Okay? Even though Zerubbabel came back and built the second temple, it was still under Persian control. And then after that, it was Greece. Greece was the next empire, and it also owned the area of Jerusalem, even though there were people there living in the area of Jerusalem, Jewish people. And then after that, Rome. Okay? Rome was the next empire. And it's even, let's see, beginning with the destruction of the second temple by the Roman Empire, even the Byzantines and the Ottomans and the British were there occupying Jerusalem. Okay? It wasn't until June 2nd of 1967 in the Six-Day War that the Jewish people regained Jerusalem. Okay? So when it says, and Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. That's a huge time frame. That's from the time of the Babylonian Empire all the way up to 1967. Okay? And that's when the Jewish people regained Jerusalem. Now remember that the beginning of the restoration of Israel happened in 1948. That's before the Six-Day War. But that's of Israel. Okay? Even though that the restoration of Israel had begun and people were coming back to Israel, okay, they still didn't have control of Jerusalem until 1967 and the Six-Day War. All right. So that's a lot of information, but that's the first question, and only the first question of the Olivet Discourse. We'll be back with the second and third question. All right. Bye-bye.